Right. Well, you just mentioned the trial. Let's get into the details there. The way I
Yeah,
understand it, this was unofficially published at the end of 2025, and the peer review process is underway now. Soon we're going to get the final paper. Is that
right.
right?
Exactly right, yes. So what we did was this is now out as a preprint. So the preprint makes it public, it makes it searchable, and it makes it citable. So those are all accomplished. But you're right, we also want to have a peer-reviewed paper out there. And so we're just finishing that up. So that should be out. It's going to be a few months by the time you get the reviews. They often will want some edits, etc., some revisions to the paper. And so that'll be a few more months, but it'll be out and it will be, somewhat similar. We've got a few additional things we've added over the preprint. But again, you can see on the preprint, you can see the summary of what we saw.
All right. Well, the way I understand it, you've done a bunch of research leading up to this paper, but this is the
Right.
first RCT, which
Right.
is the gold standard when it comes to research. So let's talk about the layout of this study and then what you can share at this point, what you found.
Yeah, you made a great point, which is that you ultimately this is the gold standard. So we started with anecdotes. So we had the first couple of people, then we had 100 more. So the anecdotes showed that again and again and again we could see reversal of cognitive decline, which just hadn't been reported before. We reported the first ones back in 2014. So then we advanced to a proof of concept trial. So we then published that in 2022 and showed, no question, that was a peer-reviewed paper to show that, yes, we can reverse cognitive decline. Then there was independent confirmation by Dr. Heather Sanderson and her team that came out in 2024. And that was showing that, yes, same sort of thing. They saw very much the same thing we did, that you could reverse cognitive decline. So then we finally, all of those led up to this randomized controlled trial. So in this controlled trial, then you have people coming in. Now, people have argued that, how is it ethical to do a trial now that we know what we know? How is it ethical to do a trial where you have people who are getting standard of care when the standard of care is not showing reversal of cognitive decline? So what we do is, this is a 9-month trial. And so you're randomized 2-to-1. So there's a 67% chance you'll get in the treatment group and a 33% chance that you'll get in the standard of care group. After 9 months, then that standard of care group is offered. They can have a free 6 months of being given the precision medicine approach, where we're looking at all these things, and you could see, in fact, the people who are in the standard of care going downhill and then bouncing up and improving after they got on the treatment. So the way it's set up, you then randomize, and then you are looking at what happens to those people over the 9 months. You're looking at cognitive changes, you're looking at imaging changes, you're looking at biomarker changes, you're looking at biochemical changes, all of those things. And what we found was striking. So you see that the people, for example, if you look at their memory scores, verbal memory plus visual memory, the group that is getting standard of care is going down, down, down during the 9 months. The group that is on the precision medicine approach is going up, 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 and improving in their cognitive scores. Really striking differences. And then, of course, the most important thing of all is the statistics. What did the statistics actually show? Was this statistically significantly different or not? And these were hugely different. Most of the values were p less than 0.001. So in other words, there was only a 1 in 1,000 chance that there was not a difference between the two groups. So striking differences. And then we also we did what's called a forest plot, where you're looking at the overall impact. So the forest plot is telling you what was the impact of the treatment. And the impact of the treatment was greater than any published trial. In fact, it was 7 times the impact of one of the, quote, breakthrough drugs, and 4 times the impact of the other, quote, breakthrough drug. And in fact, of all the trials previously published, the one that had the second best, this was 90% better than that. So again, just striking improvements in these people. And it tells you that you need, in people who have cognitive decline, and these were at the mild cognitive impairment to early dementia, very similar to the drug trials, When you look at these people, you really do need to evaluate all the different things that can potentially be giving them problems, various infections, various toxins, various metabolic problems, hormonal insufficiencies. All these different things need to be considered if you're going to get best outcomes.
By the sounds of what you're sharing here, this is going to make waves in the brain research and science realm. What do you expect to come of this when people start to see these findings?
I think with all these, medicine unfortunately has a history of changing very slowly. And if you go back, for example, to scurvy, which was a huge problem, 1600s, 1700s, etc., it took hundreds of years for people. So at each century, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, people would say, oh, I think we know what to do about this. And then the doctors would push back and say, no, that's not right. And more people would die of scurvy, which is sad. I think it's really sad. Medicine often doesn't pick up on new therapeutics quickly enough. So I expect that there will be some pushback. People will say, well, we want something different. We want something more, what have you, despite the fact that the statistics are very clear. There are commercial interests, unfortunately. And so, there's going to be pushback in various areas. But I think it'll be harder and harder to deny that this approach is getting the best outcomes. And I think in the long run, you're going to see a fusion. So there will be targeted therapeutics, targeted drugs, for example, or other approaches that are going to go with the overall precision medicine approach to get even better outcomes. So my hope is that people will not look at this as a final answer, but will look at this as the beginning, as a step in the right direction. Now, for the first time, we unquestionably, you can't argue anymore with the idea that this can reverse cognitive decline. People have said over the years, oh, nothing can reverse cognitive decline. No, we're documenting it daily now. So my hope is that people will ultimately start looking at, okay, how do we now continue to make this better? Now, in the trial, 90% of the people who were treated with the precision medicine approach improved. But some of them improved a lot, and some of them improved a little. So how do we get 100% of people to improve a lot? That's the next question. The other big question coming up is, how do we get people who are further along? You have to remember that in the drug trials and in our trial, we took people who were in that third and fourth stage, MCI, mild cognitive impairment, and early dementia. But we didn't take people who are in late-stage dementia. That's another big question. What can we do for people who have MoCA scores of 0, for example, Montreal Cognitive Assessment scores of 0? We have seen people anecdotally improve with those scores, but we haven't seen them improve all the way back to normal. So what do we need to add? And then perhaps the most important thing of all, can we get people to come in earlier? So the first two stages are pre-symptomatic, where you've already got the beginnings of the pathophysiology, but you don't have any cognitive loss. And then the second stage, which is SCI, subjective cognitive impairment, where you know something's not right, but you're still able to score within the normal range on cognitive testing. People in those two groups, 100% of them do great. Unfortunately, most people wait until the last two stages, stage 3, which is MCI, mild cognitive impairment, where now you're not scoring normally on the testing. And then, of course, stage 4, which is dementia, where you're now having trouble with your activities of daily living. So if we can just push people to come in earlier, that really will make things optional.
You hinted at this before when you were talking about ethics in the control group in your study.
Yes.
But it's important we point out conventional treatment to this point has been abysmal when it comes to cognitive decline in Alzheimer's, and there's actually been fraud in the research. I don't want to take a big part of the conversation getting into this, but really high level, just so we have a full lay of the land here. Explain that part.
Yeah, such a good point. So there's a wonderful book by Charles Piller, who's an esteemed science writer from Science Magazine. And he did an exhaustive study looking at all these things, talking about the evidence of fraud, which is, as you know, multiple sites. It's really been a huge problem because people see this This is such an impactful area with respect to hundreds of billions of dollars in the pharmaceutical market, with respect to potential Nobel Prizes for the researchers. It's such an impactful area. And so what's happened is you've got papers, and in fact, he points out one in particular, one that was very impactful and really changed a lot of research for a lot of people, turned out to be fraudulent, unfortunately. And unfortunately, led to millions of dollars of grants and a lot of stuff going in the wrong direction. And it was related to this idea that amyloid is the cause of Alzheimer's. And what we understand much better now is your body is responding to these various insults. The amyloid is a mediator. It's not the cause. So what happens is your brain recognizes when you have changes. For example, you've got a change in your oral microbiome, and there is connection there. You can have a change in your rhinosinusial microbiome. You can have leaky gut. You can have exposure to toxins. You can have metabolic changes, on and on and on. And it responds to those by producing this stuff, amyloid, which is a little bit like taking molasses. And what it does is it surrounds the pathogens, sequesters them, isolates them, and inactivates them. So when you start having, this is again why P. gingivalis, one of the oral pathogens, when it gets into the brain, you make that amyloid, which coats it and inactivates it. So what we're learning is that all of these different proteins that have been associated with neurodegeneration, and of course the claim has been they are misfolded proteins, quote, and that's an outdated thought process with respect to these diseases. These are all antimicrobial proteins. In other words, they are part of your immune system, and specifically your innate immune system. So they are upstream. And my argument is that they're actually upstream from the upstream in that they are a pre-inflammatory component. In other words, if you have small amounts of these various pathogens, you can get away with just coating them and not activating inflammatory pathways. And indeed, that's exactly what you see. There are people who will walk around with amyloid in their brains for 20 years and think just fine. So your brain is really trying to help you out. When you activate the inflammatory pathways, now you are losing synapses. Now you've got complement on these synapses. You're losing them. You're pruning them, and now you're really pulling back. And you've got a bigger war. It's a little bit like, can you fight a little skirmish and just keep things localized, or are you going to go into a much larger war? It's that inflammatory war going on in your brain that is giving you the symptoms of Alzheimer's. So the amyloid, again, it's a marker, but what it's really telling you is that your brain has recognized insults and has now used this to sequester, isolate, and inactivate these various pathogens, toxins, etc.
When it comes to the RCT, how many different things did you guys test for? And then what did treatment look like?
Yeah, a great point. So we tested for all the things that we've talked about. We looked at all the various potential causes of inflammation. We looked at the various organisms. We looked at actually about 20 different organisms, the ones that are commonly associated with cognitive decline. And we looked at the various viruses, fungi, bacteria, spirochetes, all of those. The tick-borne illnesses that I mentioned earlier. We looked at the oral microbiome. We looked at the epigenetics. We looked at the brain volumetrics. We looked at all these different things. We looked at the genetics with Intellex DNA in that particular case. Do people, for example, have an increased propensity for clotting? Some of the people will. We had one, for example, in the earlier trial. Every time he would get on a plane and go to Europe, he would start to get confused, and it would take some time to kind of get back to normal. Then over time, he's getting some decline. Well, what's going on there? This person turned out to have a tremendous propensity for clotting. So it just turned out that if you get in that where the oxygenation is not as good, and he's now on the edge of what's making the brain work. Okay, improving his clotting status improving his oxygenation status, he did great. So you got to find these things and address them. So we looked at all of those. And then what we are doing in the treatment is we're doing the 7 basics and then the 2 specifics. So we're doing, you mentioned earlier, KetoFlex 12-3 diet, which is a specific, high fiber. It is a mildly ketogenic, plant-rich diet with good prebiotics and probiotics. You're now bringing back insulin sensitivity. It is enhancing your detox. It is improving your gut microbiome. All of those things are helping to support the brain. Exercise, regular exercise, getting your heart rate up, both strength training, which improves your insulin sensitivity, by the way, and aerobics, which improves the blood flow and the oxygenation. Sleep, the 4 parameters I mentioned earlier. Stress levels, so getting your HRV up, really helpful to do. Brain training and brain stimulation. So we included photobiomodulation as well as brain HQ. And by the way, you may have seen the paper showing that double decision, which is one of the things that came from brain HQ, reduced the risk for cognitive decline even years after the brain training itself was done. And then detox, and then some targeted supplements. And so again, there are all sorts of supplements. And I want to just say a word about supplements. It's been common for people to say, well, supplements aren't a cure for Alzheimer's. Nobody's saying they are. What they do is, used appropriately, they can optimize and help you to optimize these various parameters that we're talking about. So yes, by definition, they are supplementary, but they can be very supportive. We talked about creatine. There are others, obviously, things like urolithin A and some of the resolvins that can be very, very helpful. I mean, there's just a whole, you could spend hours just talking about supplements. Again, used the right way for the right people, for the right reasons, can be very, very powerful. So those are the 7 basics. And then the 2 specifics are looking at the infections and treating those appropriately. So, for example, many people ended up having 9 months of valacyclovir. That is, part of reducing that burden. Now, I want to hasten to mention there was a trial where they just used that, nothing else, just valacyclovir, and the people actually got a little worse, not better. Well, of course, you're not addressing all these other things. You've got to get at all the different things that are driving it and address those. And then, so people would be treated for whatever infections. They had a number of people that were treated for Lyme disease, or treated for Babesia, or treated for Bartonella, for example. And then detox, and that was relatively common, that people ended up having toxicity. It's turning out, surprisingly to me, because we were never taught when I was a neurology resident or a neurology fellow, we were never taught that, hey, a common contributor to cognitive decline is going to turn out to be mycotoxins. It has turned out to be one of the most common contributors. Probably number 1 is what you mentioned earlier, metabolic dysfunction. That is probably the most common. And of course, if you've got metabolic syndrome, you multiply your risk by about 3-fold. So you have a much increased risk for cognitive decline. But I would put as number 2, mycotoxin exposure. And you've got to address those things, reduce those to get the best outcomes.
Well, let's zoom in on mycotoxins. Where are these coming in, and what are the most common ones?
Yeah, this is such a good point. So most of us don't realize we're being exposed to these things, unfortunately. And again, it's something where people say, well, gee, I didn't hear about this, so it must not be important. So the typical story is you are either living in or working in a water-damaged building. And we have people, for example, that are so sensitive to these mycotoxins that they will tell by their brain fog and their cognitive change when there's been a new roof leak. And as an example, one of the people is Sally, who started years ago. She had 6 great years of doing very, very well. She had amyloid proven, PET scan proven. She was one of these people who went on the antibodies and got worse with those. She then went on the protocol. She went her MoCA score went from 24, which is MCI, to a perfect 30. Stayed there. She's done great. After 6 years, she started having backslide. She started noticing some problems like, well, what's going on here? So it turned out, number one, she had a new roof leak. She now had more exposure to these mycotoxins. Number two, it turned out that she had some undiagnosed sleep apnea. And number three, she actually had a fungal infection in her sinuses called Cryptococcus lawrencii. So, okay, those three things were addressed. Boom, she gets back again, and now she's in her 9th year with stable improvements. She's done great, and she's one that she can actually tell if they have a new roof leak. So for most of us, we are exposed to these because of mold, and it's really unfortunate that the people do not build buildings with this idea that, wait a minute, we cannot allow wood, if we're using wood in the buildings, we cannot allow this to get wet. It's just like, yeah, it's left outside, how can that be a problem? But it is a problem. And so unfortunately, as you know, sometimes you look at these buildings and there are all sorts of wonderful building inspectors. We Inspect is one of them. There are many others that do this. And you're looking at these and they'll find all sorts of Stachybotrys. So they're the big five with respect to the molds themselves. And those are Stachybotrys, Penicillium, Aspergillus, Chaetomium, and Wallemia. Those are the big five. There are lots of others where they don't really make damaging mycotoxins, but those are the big five that you want to know about. You mentioned, which ones. Okay, the two that I worry about the most is ochratoxin A, because that one has been shown to be a specific toxin that damages your hippocampal neurons, and hippocampal neurons are compromised in Alzheimer's disease. So I worry when people have high levels of so-called OTA, and we see it all the time. The other one is various trichothecenes, that group, which typically come from Fusarium or Stachybotrys. Those I also worry about. They're quite toxic, and they are associated with cognitive decline as well. There are others. Those are the two ones I worry about the most. And so the good news, again, there are ways to detox them. You have to be careful. It's been shown, if you're overly aggressive, these things are now pouring out of the organs, and you can spike your blood levels, and you can have some transient backsliding. So that can be an issue. So you really have to be careful. It takes months and months and months to continue to just get these things out. Getting your glutathione level optimal, often with things like PK protocol, can be helpful in terms of getting these things out of your brain. But of course, as we've got this dynamic process, you're always detoxing them, you're always excreting them. You're excreting with multiple pathways, which is why binders, things like cholestyramine and Welchol and bentonite clay and things like that, have been very helpful in treatment.
Whether it be mycotoxins, microplastics, metals, it sounds like it, but do you recommend working with a practitioner to get those out?
Yes, I think it's a good idea. I think in general, you don't necessarily need a practitioner for prevention. You can do a lot. Just read the book. Go online. There's some wonderful guides. Julie Gregory, who's the one who started apoe4.info. Check out apoe4.info. It's wonderful. There are over 8,000 people on there who are all ApoE4 positive. They're doing a great job with prevention of decline. They share their secrets. The majority of them are on some version of the protocol we developed, so that's I think all of these things are key. You can look at the guides. She's produced over 100 guides that are on Apollo Health, and you can look to see various things for what about if I have to go. If I'm going to have an operation, what about anesthetic agents? What do I do to minimize the problem there? Because a common problem, as you know, is someone who then had an operation, who had anesthesia, and then started having cognitive decline. So great idea to prepare for that. And that's also mentioned in the books as well. So these are things that you can do. Then, as you indicated, if you really have cognitive decline, especially if you have late-stage SCI or MCI or dementia, any of those, that region. You really want to work with a practitioner and ask, could I talk to some people that you've worked with who've gotten better? Because there are some practitioners, as I mentioned earlier, who are not getting people to get better. And then there are others who are doing a great job getting people to get better. For example, one of the 6 sites, every single person who went on the treatment got better. So that's a really great clinician who knows what she's doing.
Since you made it to the end of this clip, I know you're going to love the full episode. Click here to watch. I'll see you over there.
About 15% of our population dies of Alzheimer's. So about 45 million of the currently living Americans will die of Alzheimer's. We can reduce that number.